When you think of America's Gilded Age, you probably picture these booming cities, maybe some industrial titans like Carnegie and Rockefeller. But way out in the heartland, a completely different story was unfolding. One of struggle, of debt, and of just plain anger. And this wasn't some quiet desperation either. No, this was the spark that ignited one of the biggest political uprisings in all of American history.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll dig into the economic crisis that pushed farmers right to the breaking point. Then, we'll look at the incredible political party they built from the ground up. We'll meet some of the charismatic, fiery leaders who gave the movement its voice. And finally, we'll see how this so-called failed movement actually ended up reshaping America for decades to come. Okay, so first things first, let's set the stage. The late 19th century was all about this massive industrial growth. But if you were an American farmer, it probably felt less like a golden age and a lot more like a stranglehold. And that really is the central question here, isn't it? The whole system, it seemed, was rigged to benefit this tiny corporate elite, leaving the very people who fed the nation feeling totally powerless and exploited. I mean, something had to give. And this right here, this gets to the heart of it. There was this huge gap between the American dream and the day-to-day reality for farmers. The promise was always independence, opportunity, being your own boss. But the reality? It was just a vicious, endless cycle of debt, all controlled by faceless banks and railroad monopolies hundreds of miles away. They were completely and utterly trapped. And look, it wasn't just one problem. It felt like a forefront war. First, they were getting crushed by these high-interest loans. At the exact same time, new technology, which should have been a good thing, meant they were growing more food than ever. But that glut of crops caused prices to just tank. On top of that, the railroads had a total monopoly and were charging them insane fees just to ship their own crops. And to cap it all off, the nation's rigid gold standard meant money was super tight. Now, if you're a farmer deep in debt, that's a disaster. It literally makes the money you owe more valuable, and your debt's even harder to climb out of. So what happens when they look to Washington for help? Crickets. Nothing. Both the Democrats and the Republicans were seen as being deep in the pockets of the very banks and corporations that were squeezing them dry. This huge political vacuum, created the perfect storm for a revolution. So if nobody was going to speak for them, the farmers decided, fine, we'll speak for ourselves. And out of this desperation, they created a brand new, powerful political force. And just like that, the People's Party, or as everyone got to know them, the Populists, was born. Now, this wasn't just some angry protest group. Make no mistake, this was a sophisticated, organized political movement, and it was designed specifically to challenge the new corporate order and yank power back to the average American. So in 1892, they unveiled their grand vision in something called the Omaha Platform. And you have to understand, at the time, these ideas were seen as absolutely radical. They wanted to add silver to the money supply, a policy they called free silver, which would cause a little inflation and make it way easier for them to pay off those crushing debts. They also demanded an income tax where the rich would finally pay their fair share, government control of the railroads, and, get this, letting everyday citizens directly elect their own senators. Of course, a movement is nothing without its leaders, and boy, the Populists have some of the most passionate, unforgettable speakers in American history. This line, this is legendary. It just perfectly captures the spirit of the entire movement. And it came from Mary Elizabeth Lease, who was an absolute force of nature, crisscrossing the country and lighting a fire under farmers everywhere she went. But Lease was so much more than just a great speaker. I mean, at a time when women were almost completely shut out of politics, she was a true trailblazer. She was out there arguing that economic justice for farmers and women's rights, well, they were two sides of the very same coin. At the same time, down in the Deep South, a leader named Tom Watson was trying to pull off something truly revolutionary for his era. He looked around and saw that poor white farmers and black sharecroppers were both being absolutely crushed by the exact same economic system. So his goal was to unite them, to build a coalition based on their shared economic class, not their race. It was a powerful, incredible vision, but it ultimately shattered against the massive wall of the era's deep, entrenched racism. It was a heartbreaking preview of a struggle that would echo through American history for another 100 years. But if there was one voice, one speech that came to define the entire movement, it was this one. These are the thunderous, immortal closing lines from what is maybe the most famous political speech in American history, and it was delivered by the man who had become the face of populism itself. That man, of course, was William Jennings Bryan. They called him the Great Commoner, and his almost supernatural speaking ability took the populist message from the Kansas prairies and blasted it onto the national stage. He ended up becoming the Democratic Party's presidential nominee, basically absorbing the populists' core ideas into a major party platform. 3 times. Think about that. 3 times he would run for president as a major candidate. He never actually won the White House, but his campaigns made sure that populism was a permanent part of the American political conversation. So if Bryan never won and the People's Party eventually faded away, does that mean they failed? Oh, not even close. And this brings us to their incredible long-term legacy. It's a classic case of losing the battle, but winning the war. See, while the party itself might have disappeared, its ideas were just too powerful to die. They stuck around. You could say the populists lost the elections, but their platform, it became the blueprint for the future of America. And this timeline, right here, this is the proof. This shows their ultimate victory. Back in 1892, their ideas were dismissed as just crazy and radical. But fast forward just 20 years, and 2 of their biggest demands, the graduated income tax and the direct election of senators, became amendments to the actual U.S. Constitution. And then a generation after that, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal inherited the populists' political DNA, putting their core belief that the government must step in to help ordinary people into practice on a massive scale. Which kind of leaves us with one last big question. The populists were born from this powerful feeling that the economic and political systems were rigged against them. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What are the common grievances? The modern-day versions of those railroad monopolies and the cross of gold that unite people to challenge the status quo today?